Hello, everyone. This is the Mazzini Society Report, and I'm Dennis Cerrotti. We're fortunate to have Dr. Jack Dempsey back again today, and Jack's going to continue talking about Thomas Morton. I wanted to begin with a little quote from Jack, and it's a characterization of Thomas Morton. He writes, Morton's adventurous, cool-headed, jolly, multicultural, sexual, and visionary 1627 May Day revels scared the shit out of his racist, Bible-toting neighbors as a bad example in front of the servants, and they still do. Well, we're going to continue on the story of Thomas Morton. Going to be talking a little bit more about his life, exploring his life and his embrace of inclusive and tolerant and joyful cultural and spiritual norms. He was a remarkable man. Today we have, besides for Dr. Dempsey, we have Yonca Denizarslani, who's a professor of English and American literature and culture in Ege University in Turkey. And we also have Lydia Olff, who's an artist and a poet. She has a book also, and I should show you that one. And I should also, it's called American Heritage. But also, pertinent to today's discussion, I want to hold up Thomas Morton of Merrymount, The Life and Renaissance of an early American poet. And this is Dr. Dempsey's book. And he also has another book called New English Canon, which is actually a compilation of Thomas Morton's book, and that's a wonderful book. You should read both of them. But without any other comments, we're going to turn to our discussion. Thank you very much for attending. So, welcome again, everybody. I'm really looking forward to this next presentation, and to pick up where we were last week is quite interesting that we had this experience of understanding in depth a man like Thomas Morton, thanks to you, Jack. And we're ready to go again and finish up, continue the discussion today. And I think I'm just going to hand it over to you, and we're going to take off. So,
okay.
Jack, thank you.
And I just want to say hello, Nita and Yonca, and again, Dennis, thank you for having me. Give a quick summary first. Last time we were talking about Thomas Morton's youth in the wild Devonshire West Country. There's a country of heaths and hills and woods and streams where he picked up his outdoorsman skills, very confident in taking care of himself in the land. Bristol, Brawling Bristol, as they call it, was Devonshire's main seaport. So that gave Thomas a little bit of exposure to the new ships, 250 a year or so, were coming back from the New World with information about what it was like there and whatnot. He also grew up in a code of hospitality and neighborliness, where you fed strangers at the door and mostly took people, civilized care of people. A code of quietness, where if you were going to end up in a fight with your neighbor at church on Sunday, you didn't go to church and no one penalized you for that, because they really valued peace and quiet on the landscape. And then in contrast to that, you have these outdoor roving feasts. It's a Devonshire tradition where people would go out onto the landscape and encamp at this body of water or this bit of forest and party for days on end and come back all with their clothing and tiaras askew and whatnot. Thomas also got a good grammar school education, upper, I would say upper end of the middle class. And he was also exposed to the fact that many cultures come and go, because across the Devon and western country landscape are Roman ruins, Celtic ruins, ruins of Catholic churches after the Reformation began. And he had a real sense that cultures come and go, very different, and can change as human inventions. So we left Thomas standing there at the Inns of Court in London, at Clifford's Inn, one of the many residences by which the young men of the realm would go to get educated in the common law, and also to make literary and professional connections, which they were expected to rise. and cultivate themselves so that they could be of service to the nascent British Empire. Masters there gave young Thomas, a really good kind of role model of taking care of the young, understanding their problems, taking them aside, educating them, mentoring them. So they had what they called moots, where the young students of the common law would sit and stand before the masters and argue a given case and have to call on the different mountains of precedent in common law to build up their argumentative skills. So Thomas Morton's skill as a writer and argumenter, you might say, were fed there. And then in London in the 1590s, 1594, I think it was, when he's about 23, they held a gigantic celebration, a civic celebration of Queen Elizabeth's reign called Gesta Graiorum. And this included many theater pieces, floating barges with torches going down the Thames, all kinds of comical and literary events, and a lot of these things that were making fun of the powerful in between the lines of their performances. So I think what Thomas Morton came out of his youth with as a professional was respect for the common law. This is something that runs in English tradition, not in the French, not in most of the European countries. There, a king's edict was law. But the English were very resistant to that. And you can see later on in his experience that Morton was also. I think he came out with an attitude you might describe, as one critic wrote, a passionate moderate. He was very intense and very learned, and he had lots going on in his mind. He was a moderate on most kind of issues. His watchword for America was respect. And in the little glosses to his text, at one point he says, watchwords, moderation, discretion. So Thomas comes out of London in his 20s. He's riding the court circuit between the West Country and London courts. And he's also beginning to work and get to know the members of the Council for New England, led by Sir Ferdinando Gorges. Now, there was a widow about halfway between London and the West Country named Alice Miller. It looks as though she had inherited from her husband a farm and an estate, and she was running a kind of what we'd call a B&B. Probably Thomas, during his riding the circuit, stayed there overnight, became friends and slowly enamored of each other. But she also had a son named George, who was an incipient Puritan, very irascible, didn't like Thomas at all, suspected that Thomas, this young lawyer, had shown up to try to sharp his way into some kind of title or rights in the land and the estate, which doesn't appear really to us now to be the case. Alice became pregnant during these terrible brawls that Thomas and she had with George. She lost the baby, and a few years into Thomas's American experience, she passed away. We don't know exactly when. There's a good scholar named Peter Moncala who's just published a book last year called The Trials of Thomas Morton. And what it comes down to as he examines the minutiae of the lawsuit between George and Thomas is the bust for Thomas. He's got no rights. He's got no financial interest anymore. Just at this time, as the first phase of his life seems to be coming to nothing, there's a call going out from the Council for New England. You see, they were over there in America to try to get the fur trade. That's where the real profits were. You could trade one cheap iron garden hoe for one beaver pelt and come away with about 800% profit. So they were looking for what they called landsmen. It's not enough to just be this fly-by-night operation where they stop on a beach, try to meet the Indians, trade for furs, and get out of there. They're looking for landsmen now, people who can function on a landscape, set up a permanent trading post, and get on. So Plymouth had become one of those efforts in 1620. Weymouth, a few miles away from there, became another such effort, more secular, in 1622. Morton arrived in June of 1624 on, yes, a ship called the Unity. He might have had some little patent or otherwise financial investment in this place on Massachusetts Bay. And he met a lot of what are called the old comers, Samuel Maverick, Samuel Blackstone, William Thompson, and others who had already lived among the Indians there. And they counseled him a lot about how to go to work. And Morton's motto became very much, I will go the surest way to work first and see how others are answered in the like kind. In other words, he was an observer first. He liked to see what was working. and adopt those methods, right? So that brings us to discuss very quickly the transatlantic, first 100 years or so of English contact with the American shores. And this evolved a code that was called by one historian cautious coexistence. English themselves at that time called them using fair means to get those furs, right? And this, you might not believe it, involved gift giving, sitting down to eat, trading, playing music on a guitar or a drum, even mummers. They even had guys coming over in hobby horse and other Maytime costumes to delight and dazzle the native people into realizing that they were harmless and they had come to do business. And sure enough, people being people, there were a lot of children born of this transatlantic period between English sailors and native women. The first grave that the Pilgrims opened on Cape Cod, they found a guy with blonde hair and a black-haired Native American baby under his arm, buried in this site. So they were somewhat unaware of the long history of contact there. As I mentioned, 250 ships roughly a year. And the first native people that they met, I'd like to give you a quick idea of that, and then I'll stop for a pause. The people Morton met were what they call in archaeology the historic period. There were 7 great confederacies of tribes in the New England area at the time, south of Maine: the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Narragansett, Pocumtuck, Pennacook, and the Pequot. And what, as I've been trying to cook this down in efficient form, what they most had in common, the two or three most common things are: one, they had a basis in farming, what they called Three Sisters agriculture: corn, beans, and squash. An amazingly labor light, incredibly productive way of organizing their gardens using fish as fertilizer and so forth. And they had, virtually all of them, a matriculture. Their elder women, they were called the Kechisquaog, their elder women would appoint and depose the sachems to conduct public business and the foreign diplomacy and so forth. And we're talking about a population between 150 to 200,000 people as Morton arrived. Now, they all shared feuds they call tribute wars, where you might kidnap people to replace individuals lost in your tribe. What they really bound together is a trade policed by intermarriage. They were all cousins, brothers and sisters. Fathers and mothers would give out their children to be made servants of an alliance or a deepening of alliance between their groups. Okay, so if I cheated you this week, my mother-in-law is going to come after me next week. Or if your cousin cheats that cousin, family is going to arbitrate and solve these problems. And that was the edge of their social control, you might say. One other thing, they had a tremendous, what we call a fluidity of tribal identity. This is to say, according to, say, a Pequot scholar named Peter Thomas, that identity for them was episodic. Suppose you were living half the year in a Narragansett village and half the year in a Wampanoag. You might even have a different name because you're switching back and forth among different family members, things like that, and that the communities cooperated during a crisis. Well, this all comes as a heritage and inheritance of 13,000 years on the land. At Ancient Lights, you can see all kinds of wonderful illustrations by the great painter David Wagner, native New England, and how it must have looked back then. 13,000 years of learning how to live well here. This goes all the way back to the Ice Age, when they have stories in their oral tradition of people walking Nantucket Island to visit their relatives. As the ice melted and the oceans rose again, there had been almost 500,000 more square miles to New England than we now see today. The melting overflowed the Great Depression that is now Long Island Sound. And right near Block Island, there was a waterfall, they estimate 60 times the size of Niagara Falls.
Oh,
60 times the size of Niagara. So they had these things in their memory. And you can see one other thing I could recommend, the stoneworks. The native New Englanders were tremendous builders with stone in subtle ways that most of the population, even now today, miss. There's a video on YouTube by a guy named Jim Vieira called Stone Chambers. Spell his name, Jim, Vieira, Jim Vieira, Stone Chambers. And you'll see for an hour the most amazing, wonderful, mysterious things that Native New Englanders are doing. So finally, before I pause here, I just want to have people realize that by the 1610s and the 1620s, Native New England had been almost struck by a nuclear weapon, that is to say, the plague, of these god-awful bacilluses that came from the appalling lack of sanitation in European cities, including London. It was called Wisawasamich here in the native New England tongue. And it's estimated to have wiped out 8 or 9 out of 10 of the Massachusetts and other tribes right facing Morton. So Morton met a group of the Neponset, Massachusetts, that's the name of a river, the Neponset, where they mostly inhabited. And the man's name was Chickatawback. And they began to spend a lot of time together, looking, listening, observing, talking to each other, learning about each other. And this is reflected in the first 20 chapters of Morton's book. He puts them right up front. There are people here. Very important point for him. So Morton is out there examining and exploring nature, cataloging the trees and animals. He has a day book where he keeps people and events, descriptions thereof. And the native people on their side acquired status and goods and firearms, we'll come to that, and allies in these exotic, strange, unpredictable Englishmen. So as I pause here and just see what y'all have to say or would like to know, etc., I'm going to promise you that Morton's next part of his story is a rare historical experiment. It's going to show you some very interesting things about what went on there.
Can I start, Jack?
Sure.
Thank you again for this interesting talk. While you were mentioning about early settlers' cautious coexistence with Native Americans, I was thinking about Cotton Mather's Magnelli Christi Americana and Wonders of the Invisible, where he advocated the idea that, where he also advocated Salem witch trials and asserted that settlers were dealing with witchcraft because they were so closely living with Native Americans. There were so many interactions between the colonials and Native Americans. Cotton Mather was blaming people for being so close to Native Americans. So how far the Puritans have gone from these early comers cautious coexistence to that idea that their food, their ways of living were bewitched by the Native Americans. I mean, in Cotton Mather's minds, this is really interesting how this was changed in a century.
Sure, and without getting ahead of the segments of Morton's story so we can understand his life chronologically is always the way I like to go as a scholar. I would have to say, and in response to that, Yonca, that Thomas Morton's career was the watershed. In other words, there he is on the landscape, cohabitating, living with, or intimately close to Native American tribes. So also the young men that were with him at that trading post that they began to call Merrymount eventually. And he even says that one of the reasons that we held our revels, again, getting ahead here, but was because his young men wanted to have wives, but they didn't want to make the voyage back to England, get a white wife. So they were willing to marry the native people. Now, after all the frivolity had resulted in Morton's first arrest, they shipped him to England. He came right back unmolested. They arrested him again, kicked him out of the country. But he was their first order of business. The Puritans of Boston arrived in June 1630. By the time they mustered together a court of law in September of that year, you look on the records, in the editor's name is Shirtleaf. Morton is the first order of business. They're going to kick him out of the country on any trumped up charge they can. And following that entry into their records, guess what? They're passing laws against people living together with native people, passing laws against people having uncontrolled or unsupervised trade with them, passing laws that virtually from every direction will forbid, interrupt, or stop altogether uncontrolled contact with Native Americans. So in a sense, as usual, they have only themselves to blame, because when you deny something rather than get to know about it, you become afraid of it. But it's still there. So you've done all you can with law, maybe even with guns, but you can't get rid of them, at least not yet. And so the fear and the anxiety grow. And any little irregularity in Puritan culture was very strictly noticed. And if they had to, they would attribute that to Satan, of course. And who was next in line after Satan? If you couldn't convince them it was Satan's temptation, excuse me, that would be Native people. You've been talking to Indians again. What do you mean walking around in the woods by yourself? That's crazy. It's dangerous. They had a whole ideology to separate the races. They put it in their law books on the first page right after Thomas Morton. So it's not surprising they suspected such influences everywhere, when it was more, I think, I'm sorry how it sounds, but more a function of their own paranoia.
There was a law in Boston that in 1675, much later, Indians weren't allowed in town in Boston. I know that broadside. I'm familiar with that. But what I wanted to follow up. I have a few questions.
Sure.
I'm very curious as to when Yonca mentioned in the last video that Morton saw this as the New World. And in American culture, the New World is accepted as nobody was there. But I think that Yonca was saying, recognizing what Morton was saying, that there were, all these people and cultures established. And yeah, I was wondering, Yonca, if that's what you meant, hearing Jack's discussion about how many people there were actually and the interconnectedness. Just wanted to confirm that that's what you meant when you said that he saw it as a new world.
Well, this I think about this dichotomy of the new and the old, starting with the colonial efforts, and as soon as they started discovering new places, newcomers tended to think about their earlier experiences, their earlier cultural frames of references in a different way. So this is, surely they were influenced by their new experiences in the new place. But this dichotomy between the new world and the old world prevailed long in the colonial history. Because colonialism itself was a kind of how to say, it's like an utopia. Before you go to a place, you make plans, you try to imagine what kind of places you are approaching. So even they started approaching to the shores of the northeast or northeastern America, they had plans. For example, usually mainstream historians talked about John Winthrop's or William Bradford's arrival to the New World as the only initial how to say initial attempts. But before they came to Massachusetts, they had already planned to establish themselves in the Caribbean. They established Providence Islands. So before they approached to the New World, what they had in mind was to profit from their future. So their profit-mindedness was disguised under this ideology of Puritanism, to build a city upon a land, upon a hill, to build a God's glorified city. This was a disguise to them. But no matter how most European colonizers tend to think about New World this way, there were differences among French, Portuguese, and Spanish and English colonizers, mostly Spanish colonizers. were not excluding people. I think this most of you are might understand this. I think this stems from Catholicism and Puritanism. Catholicism welcomes people. This is the doctrine, okay, to deliver God's message. But Puritans are not that way. They don't. Yeah, they are not welcoming. They are not all inclusive of people. They don't. This is not their desire to welcome people to their religion. So I think we should also pay attention to how Spanish, French, Portuguese colonizers were different from English colonizers because of their religious backgrounds also. And yeah, many historians say that New America was not only discovered but also invented. I think this is what they try to mean by saying that. Am I clear, Nina, now?
Yes, and that brings me back to what Jack said about the culture and the amount of people that were there for 13,000 years. I was fascinated. That struck me as really critical. And if I may, I'd like to ask Jack a question about the land. I was fascinated when you said that there was, in the Long Island Sound near Block Island, waterfalls that were bigger than Niagara Falls.
60 times.
I mean, I want to see that or find out about that. That is immense to me. I mean, so amazing.
There's some artwork depicting what it probably looked like by David Wagner at the ancientlights.org site.
Okay, thanks. I don't want to take, so that just like, I have to find out about that, and I appreciate all the connections you made to how families worked, tribes worked, clans worked with other groups and formed certain pacts, and there was always some fighting and, restitution, I suppose, but they lived on the land for, as you said, with the land for 13,000 years without destroying it, I might add. Okay.
Yeah, imagine that. Yeah. And I'd like to say one thing to Yonca's point that is very, very important, especially in nowadays scholarship, to look at the English and the Puritans in the context of the general assault by Europe on the New World. And when many of the explorers, first the Spanish, then the French, then the English, then the Dutch, when they made their reports back to the old country, they would often mention, there are people there, and here's how you handle them. There are people there, and here's what we should do as a matter of policy. Spanish and the French were willing to intermarry and take Native American wives because that was the easiest way into the social web, facilitated your doing well in the fur trade. On the other side, the Spanish were horrific butchers in a lot of the places that they went, and so were the French. So the English looked at those reports and said, well, where are the English? We're going to do better. We're going to do better. And this ties in directly with that first 100 years of the transatlantic. They were trying. That's what they meant by using fair means. Let's amuse them. Let's dazzle them with gifts. Let's show them our strength. Let's dance and intermarry with them on at least a temporary basis so that we can get what we want from them without doing any harm. And these were the methods that were still going on in that cautious coexistence over the first 100 years, to which Morton suddenly stepped. Dennis, did you want to throw something in?
Actually, it's interesting that you bring this whole thing up, because I think one of the things that strikes me about Morton is he had a real sense of the opposing force, that he was caught in a crux of opposing forces that were just tremendous and way beyond his ability to control. And it kind of reminds me, I don't know,
aren't we all?
Yeah, but it kind of it reminds me of the myth of Sisyphus. Here's a guy who's willing to continue rolling the rock up the hill, and continues at it. But the thing that also strikes me about this is that how much effort he put into writing this section of the book about Native Americans. He wasn't content with just, talking about the experience, but he went deeply into their culture. And and I also think of Roger Williams, who did the same thing in his book, The Key into the Language of America. And he did the same thing. And here's another man just a few years later who's caught in the crux of these opposing forces. And you think about it just in terms of, the evolution of this, we're actually caught in the same thing right now, culturally, politically, in this country, in the United States, because, we've got this group of crazy religious right wingers right now who are controlling the sexual, habits of American females. It's just, we've gone back into, Gordon and Morton's time in some sense. I mean, we don't trust taking the reins of power, and Morton community faced annihilation, and we realize that these kinds of conflicts are never easily resolved.
And when studied, when listened to, Morton can speak to that as well, our contemporary problem and what the roots of it are. So let's push on into his biography and see what the heck happened with all these people. Morton, as I mentioned, he comes in 1624, and for the first 3 years, he's struggling like hell to maintain this trading post because his backers in England have basically abandoned him. They're not sending supply, they're out of regular touch and so forth. And so the ship's captains who come by and visit once in a while, they start to take some of the indentured men, there were 30 of them, we're told, and sell their contracts down to the plantations in Virginia. And that was a hellhole. That was a place where the English were trying to grow tobacco by farming it in a swamp. It's a very labor-intensive agricultural practice, and the young men down there were dying of fevers, disease, and exhaustion left and right. So Morton said, as things kind of came apart, let's stay here together as equals, as consociates, and we'll live together, trade together, build our houses together, deal with the Indians together, and make our own life here. So I think a young man who's otherwise he's going to go back to England or to Virginia would be happy to say, okay, I'm in. And that's what they did. Now, the Pilgrims had been here since 1620. This is now about 4 years ago. And they came off the boat with a real mental agenda of reform. They had been reformers of the decadent Anglican Church in England. They had been reformers when they had lived among themselves in the Netherlands and began to lose their thoughts, you might say, and panicked. And so they jumped on the first available ship. Big mistake, because they were trying to get a soldier to go with them. Captain John Smith, they interviewed, who had been to New England, and he said, please go in the wintertime. Wait till the summer to make your crossing voyage. But they didn't want to wait. So they jumped on the boat, came over, and half of them died on that beach at Plymouth in the first season of their presence there. That gave them a really traumatic take on the harshness of the environment. And it was only with Native American help they began to resuscitate them. They were shocked, by the way, when Samoset and Squanto at Squantum walked into their camp speaking broken English. How could that be? Well, there's the transatlantic. They're speaking a mixed language, as Thomas Morton said, already for about a century. So here's the experiment that I was talking about. Morton's working by the fair means and cautious coexistence of the transatlantic. Pilgrims come in with a reform agenda, and here's what happened. There were a number of offenses committed against Native people between 1621 and 23, on behalf committed by also Weymouth settlers. Native people were starting to speak up very strongly to say, you said we had a treaty. You said we would make justice between our different parties. What are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? How can you help, if you can, my family, which is dying in the village of this plague that you people keep bringing over? And the Plymouth answer was basically nothing. Get lost. We really, all we want with you is your trade. They had the one Thanksgiving and they never repeated it. Okay, so the spring of 1623, which is coming up this year, 400 years, the Pilgrims, here's that word paranoia again, they began to hear in native anger a plot, wipe them all out. And the Massachusetts and the Wampanoags could have done that easily. In fact, as one non-apportionment scholar even said, all they would have had to do was ignore them and stop anybody from helping them out, and that would have destroyed them because they were totally unprepared to be here. Instead, the Pilgrims set up a trap, murdered about 7 of these native leaders, cut their heads off, and put them on top of their fort-church, which they had built, surrounded with a palisade at Plymouth. And the colony's first flag was a white sheet in blood. A shipmaster from not the Plymouth congregation happened to come through that summer, and he saw these horrible things on the watchtower of the church, and he was scratching his head saying, I think I understand why you're not having very good trade with native New Englanders now. Okay, so the transatlantic, the Pilgrims' methods end in that mass murder of the people who object to them. And then here comes Morton, right into the same Massachusetts Bay region, dealing with the same native people who had been injured so severely by Plymouth people, and he does very well. What's the key to that? It's his trade, I believe, in guns. In other words, the Neponset, Massachusetts said, this is what we want. If you want permission to stay here and farm in our now empty gardens from all the losses of our people, we want guns, not to hurt English, to intimidate their rivals. Guns were not really a useful tool in combat yet because they were so unreliable. They were as likely to kill you as the guy you're aiming at. Morton knew as a common law lawyer also that, yeah, there'd been a king's edict against trading guns to the Indians since about 1618. But that was not the law. And thirdly, Council for New England, Morton didn't have the money to buy crates of guns and sell or trade them on the frontier. It was the Council for New England that was winking and supplying him those trade goods in order to get fur profits. That is the all-consuming, all-driving force in this whole story, the profits of the fur trade. And this finally is why Morton was never prosecuted for any of his notorious and race traitorous gun trade with them. So, going to come next to a pause here. By 1627, here's the cover of Morton's book, New English Canaan, the painting by David Wagner of the Maypole. Morton wrapped together all these different factors in a May Day Revels. He wrote a poem nailed to the maypole here that says, we're going to get together every year and ritualize our moment of compassion for each other when we first met, because the English were on their last legs and the native people were really hurting as well. They found that they needed each other. And the drinking song, Holding Hands Around the Maypole, Morton wrote, there are 4 verses. And the first word of each verse is make, nectar, give. That's his formula. Generosity. Invite everybody, even the Pilgrims, even the Puritans. He invited them to the party, and they came and grumbled at everything they saw and puzzled at the poem on the maypole and couldn't figure it out and thought it was an inscription to the devil and all this kind of crazy stuff. The purpose of the revels was to make wives for the young men, to heal native people who were suffering so severely from the plague and other problems, give people hope and a sense of a future founded in sympathy, respect, and there is our first English poetry. So it's no wonder we almost don't know about Thomas Morton and the fact that he's our first poet in English. I'm sorry, but because exactly of what he had to say. We ought to respect, feel compassion for each other, and get along. So whose methods do you think really worked? I'd welcome, again, questions, comments, anything you'd like to say.
Let me jump in here. You know,
Sure.
it's interesting that we've painted Morton. You painted Morton as the figure he was. You know, a Renaissance figure, a man of high moral purpose and generosity, and he's all these wonderful characteristics, and yet he's run out of time. But when I studied Thomas Morton, it was modern historians that I was reading, and one of them, of course, was a familiar one probably to you is Alden Vaughan, who wrote a book called New England Frontier back in the 1960s. Well, the way he characterized Thomas Morton was a lawyer of dubious scruples. This comes from your book. A lawyer of dubious scruples. And in 1965, and it's just reminiscent of the other kinds of remarks that I've read on the part of historians. So just a remark on on Thomas Morton and how he's been held up in the historical narrative.
Well, I think part of it is due to the way that American literature and history were originally taught. American colleges did not exist until, let's say, Harvard, which was founded as a school for Indians. It was founded, they raised their funds for it, promising that they were going to convert all the natives to Christianity and educate them and whatnot, right? But the writings that people created were very much a function of their careers. Was the ministers and the doctors of divinity, whatever that means, that were teaching the original college courses. And this filtered down into the smaller schools. And so if you wanted to have a career as an educator in the New England society of those times, Puritan and post-Puritan, you had to toe the line. And Morton was the exact limning all the different behaviors on the frontier that you must not do. That cost us, and Native people especially, a tremendous amount. And we're going to get to that very soon.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point at which we can finish our discussion for today and move forward next week when we meet together. And anybody want to finish up? Anybody has a comment that you want
I have one comment that I've noticed, and it is that we keep the term the new world. It's their new world. They're seeing it for the first time. It's not a new world.
Yes.
It's like it becomes embedded. The way the language you use formats the way you think. So this discussion has brought to my mind that saying the new world, it's just like Columbus discovered America. There were 13,000 years of many different cultures. It's not the new world. It's new for them.
Yeah, it's
I don't know. It's just
oxymoron.
yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
It's okay with me. Thank you, Nina, for your reply. Yes, this is their new world. If you have read Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, in the very first chapter, he says the first two things they did when they arrived in the colony to build a cemetery and a prison house. And while Hawthorne was describing the outlook of the prison house door, he was saying the wooden artifact of the prison house door was looking more ancient than the New World itself. It is because they brought their old world, legal culture, their morality, so they aged the New World. Hawthorne was saying, maybe this can be a connection with your response.
Yeah, and it's been noticed by historians. I think Hawthorne made the original comment, which was when the Puritans cut down Morton's maypole, they inevitably thereby erected the whipping post. So instead of using pleasure and ritual and humans' natural inclinations to organize them and keep them in a good society, Puritans mistakenly thought that they could do that with a whipping post. I just want to close by saying next meeting, we're entering with, as you think about Thomas Morton's riotous rebels and marriage ceremonies and whatnot on the landscape, next week, the Puritans start to come to get him. And this begins what I call Morton's Keystone Cops period, because the funny stories about how he outwitted them again and again, why they kept trying to repress him, but he kept coming back, and what ultimately happened to him, and then his influences and so forth. We'll dive into that right at the beginning next time, huh?
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank all of you. See you next time.
Hanging on until the bitter end, as they say. Anyway, just a few other things. I want to remind you, we love your support. So if you could hit that subscribe button and the like button, would be very much appreciated. We want to know what your comments might be, what your Anything that you'd like to contribute, write down in the comments section. We definitely will be reading it. And also, I want to remind you that this conversation is going to continue. Thomas Morton is a character who should be in the public mind, should be a household name, as a matter of fact. I think you've gained by staying this long with the video to know that we're really serious about this, to bring this man's his life and his example up into the light, so that Americans understand the true nature of their beginnings. So we hope that you'll come back again. We appreciate your support. Thank you.